These days on Sundays, we've been taking a look at the small catechism and some of the essentials of the Christian faith with the help of our older brother in the faith, Martin Luther. And lately, we've turned to the Creed, that sort of ancient statement that grew out of maybe the 2nd century of the church's life, that was a summary, a simplified version of here are some essentials about what we believe about God. Of the commandments we looked at were some essentials about how we behave toward neighbors and toward God. The Creed is sort of a summary of, well, who is this God that we say we believe in? What is God like? We talked about believing in God, the Father, the Creator who creates not just in the ancient distant past, but each one of us now. And then this past week, we turned to the 2nd article of the Creed, which begins, I believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of God. There's some essentials that maybe seem obvious to us that are worth us spending a minute of time talking about. For the early church, in both the Western Latin-speaking church out of Rome and the Eastern-speaking church that became the source of what we now call the Nicene Creed, there was a really important question about who is this Jesus? Is he like God's #1 prophet? Is he like God's vice president of human affairs? Is this somehow really God, fully God, as well as being fully human? And spoiler alert, the consensus of the church in early centuries was, what we have in Jesus is nothing less than the fullness of God and also fully human. Those are things that we Lutheran Christians are used to affirming week after week when we say Jesus is God from God and light from light and true God from true God, of one being with the Father, when we use the words of the Nicene Creed. That maybe that doesn't seem like it's a big deal at all, but that's really essential. That whatever Jesus does, God does. Whatever Jesus is like, God's like. So it's not so much that you get to know what Jesus is like by thinking about God, but if you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. Look at the people he hangs out with, the people he forgives, the people whose feet he washes, the way he's willing to challenge and go toe-to-toe with the respectable religious people, the way he loves, the way he lays down his life, the way he blesses the peacemakers and the poor, the way he refuses the trappings of empire. That's what God is like. Now, that's a pretty powerful idea. And if you think about it, the essential story of Jesus that's told in the Creed really is kind of boiled down to birth and barely anything said about his life and ministry, and then turns to his death on a cross under the power of the empire, under Pontius Pilate, his death, his burial, his descending to the dead, and then his resurrection. Now, that's a place, that phrase, descended to the dead, that we spent a little more time this past Sunday talking about. And this was questions that came up out of our conversation around the table, because you may know, if you've been someone who's used to reciting the words of the Apostles' Creed for more than a few years, there are a couple of different English translations floating around, and they render that phrase differently. I grew up saying Jesus descended into hell, and other translations, like ones we more frequently use on Sunday, say descended to the dead. So what's the difference? Did somebody start blushing at the mention of hell and said, well, we can't have that, or sanitize the Bible? All right, here's the quick and dirty. The Apostles' Creed was originally written in Latin. It wasn't written in English, it was written in Latin. And the phrase in Latin for where Jesus descended to is ad infernes. Well, what's that? Well, it's the Latin word for the realm of the dead. So sort of like the way maybe in English we talk about the underworld, lots of cultures, lots of languages have a word for just, wherever the dead go. That's not necessarily exactly about punishment or rewards, but just, whatever happens to the dead. In ancient Hebrew, in the Old Testament, the word for it is Sheol, and it just means sort of, again, the realm of the dead, the underworld. In Greek mythology and thinking, the word is Hades, and it's where the god of the dead, Hades, lives. And it's not a terrible place of punishment, it's just kind of blah, like imagine all the color being sucked out of everything in black and white or something like that. Lots of cultures have words like that. In fact, English borrowed a word like that from Norse mythology. Norse mythology had a word for the place that most people went when they died. It wasn't a place of punishment. It just wasn't the greatness of Valhalla, which was reserved for noble warriors. The place everybody else went was called hell. Yeah, just the word for the underworld, the place where the dead go. Hell in Norse, and English ended up borrowing that word. So the original wording of the Apostles' Creed isn't so much to say Jesus went to a place of eternal torment for some reason, but more to say wherever the dead go, whatever it is to be all the way dead, Jesus went into all the way death, completely, fully, and wholly. And that means God knows what it is to be swallowed up completely by death. There is no length God has not gone to for you and for me. See, when I was a kid, I heard this phrase, descended into hell, and sometimes I assumed that meant, after dying on the cross, God needed Jesus to suffer somehow even more, and so then God sends Jesus to hell to suffer and be tortured with pitchforks and flames, when that's not really what this is about at all. Now, there is some tradition, there are some in the long, long 2 millennia history of Christianity who have spun out the idea maybe Jesus does go to the realm of evil or the realm of Satan or something like that, but not in order to suffer, but to bust people out of it. In fact, there's this long tradition in the Eastern Orthodox Church that between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, Jesus does go to the realm of the dead and takes out by the hand Adam and Eve and all the dead who are held captive in the chains of death. So that Jesus' death and resurrection is about the death of death itself, the breaking open of death from the inside out. It's a jailbreak. Jesus goes in and busts it from the outside open. So if you want to picture Jesus going to some realm of the dead on Holy Saturday, you can. It's just worth knowing the Orthodox Church has classically seen that as not suffering for Jesus, but busting out in victory. Or maybe picture the way after World War II, the Allies would ride their vehicles through Berlin and Rome as sort of signs of we defeated the Axis powers. It was a victory march, in other words. Whatever it means to say Jesus descended into the dead or to hell, it's not that Jesus has to suffer more, but that this is the beginning of God's victory. One other interesting variation, a theologian in the 16th century named John Calvin, who was about a generation or two after Martin Luther. He had this idea, and he's probably not the only one, but he says, when we say Jesus descends into hell, well, what is hell after all but God forsakenness? And what does Jesus say from the cross? But my God, why have you forsaken me? That when we say Jesus descends into hell, it's not a second thing that happens after Good Friday. It's a theological way of saying what's happening on Good Friday. That what happens at the cross is not simply that Jesus endures a lot of physical pain, but that also Jesus, or God, you might say, endures what it is for God to experience God forsakenness, for the very Trinity to be ripped right to the brink as God the Father and God the Son experience this tearing apart. That these are the lengths God is willing to go to. So again, while exactly what the Apostles' Creed has in mind is probably a little bit nebulous and just sort of stops short of saying, wherever you go when you're dead, that's where Jesus went. Jesus goes all the way into the valley of the shadow of death. He doesn't say, I'll meet you on the other side, but I'm not going in the dark valley. Ours is the God who goes into the valley of the shadow of death. And we could say there's nothing then that God won't do and hasn't done for us. But it's not about saying Jesus needed to suffer more after the cross. That seems important. So we're going to pick up next week as we take a look at the third article of the Creed and what it means to believe in the Holy Spirit and the community that the Spirit brings us into that we call church. We hope you'll join us along the way as we keep looking at the essentials of the faith, the catechism, getting to the heart of things. See you then.